You're listening to The Dispatch from WPRB News. This is the second part of an interview with Peter H. Stone from the National Journal. You also mention in your story someone named Raffaello Foglieri, and he's a well-connected Italian socialite who's run into a bit of legal trouble recently. Now, Davis, McCain, and Foglieri were all connected in a series of meetings, and there was a bit of influence peddling apparently going on. What ways could the type of lobbying, both the type we were discussing before with Ferry and Davis, helping out foreign politicians, foreign governments, and even this Foglieri situation, how could that type of lobbying play a role in crafting policy both in the campaign but also once politicians are elected to office?
Well, that's a little bit complicated in terms of tracing it to policy decisions. But let's go back to the example that you were talking about, the Foglieri situation, for a minute. I mean, the issue that I tried to address in the story by way of several clients and would-be clients. Foglieri was a would-be client who Davis was courting for his firm. And he was courting this gentleman, Foglieri, who pled guilty to fraud last month in New York. He was the guy who got a lot of ink in the Wall Street Journal and other publications and a lot of New York tabloids because he was going around New York for several years boasting of his ties to the Vatican. And he also was dating Anne Hathaway, so he made a lot of tabloid news back in those days, the actress Anne Hathaway. But the circumstances involving Davis and the senator are a little bit complicated, but let me try and sum it up simply. I mean, in the summer of 2006, when Davis was starting to work for the campaign, and McCain was taking a congressional trip to Montenegro with other members of Congress, Davis was not part of the CODEL, the congressional campaign, but he was over there on other issues. And he did arrange a little bash, or he invited the senator, I guess, to attend a little party on a boat that Foglieri had rented. And it was the 70th birthday of the senator, and the both of them went to this briefly. That's what we know about it. I know separately, and this was actually first reported in The Nation magazine, this and the London Times, this event. But separately, I learned that Foglieri, and The Nation reported some of this too, that Foglieri was being eyed not only as a client by Davis Manafort, but Davis was also telling people at the campaign, according to a couple of my sources, that he would be helpful with Catholic outreach efforts, a very crucial part of a campaign. So he seemed to be a little bit snowballed, if you will, or a little bit dazzled by Foglieri, and saw him as a kind of a twofer, somebody who might be a client for his firm and also somebody who could help the campaign. I reported also in the story that after this one meeting, there was a second event up in New York several months later in 2007, a little dinner that Davis arranged. I don't know how many people attended, but my sources told me that the senator went to it, and Davis and Foglieri attended it as well, a small dinner. Some people who were close to the campaign advised against this, but it happened nonetheless, according to my sources. I think the issue here is, how you separate private interests and the campaign's interests. And in this case, they seem to be mixed a little bit. And obviously in this case, too, the fact that Foglieri had a questionable background, that there were stories out there suggesting before his plea just last month, suggesting that he might be a bit of a huckster, showed some, risk-taking on the part of Davis and perhaps improper vetting of who they were setting the senator up with. I think that's one issue that arises from these kind of circumstances. And the story looks at Davis, who's the campaign manager, and his deputy, Christian Ferry, and talks about, Ferry was involved in the Ukraine work on behalf of the pro-Russian candidate. And it looks at a couple other circumstances as well where the other other meetings took place with folks with controversial backgrounds. One of the people who I asked about this is a former aide to Colin Powell, Secretary of State, Larry Wilkerson, and I asked him, as somebody who's experienced in the foreign policy arena, does this pose conflict problems or ethics problems? And Wilkerson, summed it up pretty well, I thought, when he told me, in his eyes, quote, when you take central advice from people who have advocated for foreign interests not necessarily congruent with American interests, it's really naive to assume that the advice you're receiving is not influenced by their previous work. I think that goes to the heart of the dilemma here and the potential conflicts. And in this case, you have McCain's campaign manager, Davis, his deputy, who was his former partner, Davis Manafort, his subordinate, and a couple other top officials, too. The key foreign policy advisor for McCain is a fellow named Randy Schuneman, who worked on his 2000 campaign in the foreign arena, too. But Schuneman has built himself a little business representing a lot of work involving foreign governments he represented in Washington. And they included governments such as the government of Georgia and Taiwan and Latvia and Macedonia. One of McCain's top advisors, senior advisor Charlie Black, a longtime, very influential Republican lobbyist, has had a number of foreign clients too, including some with controversial reputations, the government of Equatorial Guinea in Africa, which has been a corruption-plagued nation. And he also represented a small, little-known Moscow think tank that was chaired by the former telecom minister under Putin, and the gentleman who chaired the think tank, Mr. Black's client very briefly in 2005, has been under scrutiny by German prosecutors who are looking into money laundering allegations. So you sometimes find that in a campaign, and the McCain campaign seems to have several people in quite senior positions who've done a fair amount of this work, either representing foreign governments, foreign interests in Washington, or doing the kind of consulting that Davis Manafort was doing in the Ukraine and elsewhere. And it gets kind of murky how you can separate possible conflicts, possible improprieties in these kind of situations.